Good afternoon. Welcome to our series 2021 Philosophers, dedicated to thinkers who reshaped the landscape of contemporary philosophy. I conceived this series of 20 philosophers with the idea of a renewal of knowledge and reflection, and my guest today perfectly embodies this renewal. I would even say this revolution. Pierre Vesperini, in a few books, has indeed revolutionized what is called ancient philosophy. The great theoretical and political debates are not always played out in our present time. They can take place in ancient times, especially when it is a question of rethinking the foundation, the origin of our culture. A too easy genealogy makes us believe that the Western world and its ideas of democracy, rationality, philosophy come directly from Greece and Rome. But what the Greeks or Romans meant by democracy, reason, and philosophy may have nothing to do with what we practice today. Pierre Vesperini demonstrates it by rereading Marcus Aurelius and Lucretius in a truly new way. He's interested in philosophical practices and discourses in their social uses. And he observes what philosophia was, quite different from philosophy, as we have fixed it for 2 centuries. Pierre is a researcher at the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research in France. He authors La Philosophia et ses pratiques d'Ennius à Cicéron in 2012, Droiture et mélancolie sur les écrits de Marc Aurèle in 2016, Lucrèce, archéologie d'un classique européen, 2017, and La philosophie antique, essai d'histoire in 2020. He's currently working at a book on Western rationality. Pierre will give a talk about 30-40 minutes, and you can ask him your questions through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. This meeting will be recorded, and you can watch it on our YouTube channel. Pierre, welcome to the Maison Française of NYU.
Thank you very much, François. My task here, as you wrote me in an email, is to present my philosophical reflection on the long run or recent. And I think the notion of philosophical reflection can be understood in 2 ways. It can refer to the results of the reflection, that is a series of statements or of opinions, or it can refer to the way the reflection proceeds, that is the approach. And it is the approach I use in my work that I would like to talk about today. Generally speaking, I'm more interested in conveying an approach than specific opinions. So, to explain my approach, the first thing I have to do is to tell the audience what I mean by the word philosophy. I think that, broadly speaking, one could distinguish 2 meanings. The first one, the easier one, is the academical meaning. Philosophy as an academic discipline with various traditions, various canons, various curricula, depending on the country or depending on the university. According to this definition, philosophy is not a thing that exists in all eternity and across the world. There is no philosophia perennis, no perennial philosophy, nor is there any world philosophy. It is not eternal but historical, not necessary but contingent, not universal but rooted in very recent academical traditions, which ultimately do not go back further than the beginning of the 19th century. So, as a historian working on what the Greeks and the Romans called philosophia, I have always been careful and eager to show that it had nothing in common with the modern academical concept of philosophy. And this led me, of course, to disagree with many historians of philosophy. In these disputes, I would always argue that philosophy is not a thing, but a name, and that this name has and had different meanings along the ages and along the cultures. But then a strange and ironical phenomenon occurred. People kept presenting me not as a historian, as I thought myself to be, but as a philosopher. And for my part, I kept correcting people. No, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian. But the more it went on, the more I felt myself ill at ease. There was a kind of tiny voice inside of me that said, come on, you are ridiculous. If you are a consequential historian, if you think philosophy is but a name, then you have to take people at their word and find what they mean by that. So what did they mean by that? And I think they perceived something that I did not perceive, or rather that I did not want to perceive. And that is, although I always presented myself as a historian, I was not merely trying to reconstruct the past. I was after something else. And to me, this expression, to be after something else, encapsulates maybe what it is to be a philosopher in the non-academical meaning of the word. To be a philosopher, then, is to be engaged in whatever activity. It can be medicine, gardening, law, carpentry, or even finance, or even philosophy in the academical sense of the word. You have it, but without being totally satisfied with this activity. There is no tenured philosopher in this sense. A philosopher is always on the move, always after something else. He tries to understand, even though he does not know exactly what it is that he is after. As soon as he can say, I am after this or that, to my mind, he quits being a philosopher and becomes a specialist. The objects of his thinking must always remain as open and as large as possible. I also think anyone can become a philosopher. One needs only a certain amount of free time. Ideas can come up even while one is busy doing something else, for example, playing soccer or cooking. Indeed, I have experienced that ideas come much easier. Because of the pandemics, I have been taking care of the education of my 6-year-old son for months now, so I have much less time to read and work. But I have been astonished by the amount of ideas that flowed into my mind during these activities. So being busy, if the activity is not, of course, something so mechanical that it numbs the mind, does not prevent one from thinking. But then free time is necessary to work out your ideas. And this free time, what the Greeks called schole and the Romans otium, that is more and more denied to most people in modern society. Otherwise, I'm sure one would see many more philosophers in the world and many more artists too. For the philosopher in this broader conception of the word is not very different from the artist. Both create intellectually or aesthetically, but in the end, it is always about letting one's mind, one's demon, if you will, have its way, its own way, and flow into some work of thought or of art. So for years, I have been totally unable to understand, even remotely, what it was that I was after. And now things become a little clearer, and I will try to explain it as precisely, as vividly as possible. When I say as vividly as possible, I mean that a philosophy is often, maybe always, embedded in someone's existence. And it would be, I think, artificial and abstract to do as if a philosophy came out of someone's mind as Athena from Zeus's head. As I grew older, I came to realize that three important features of my way of doing philosophy appeared in my childhood. And the first one is the books. From a very early age, I have been reading books of history. I would also read fictions, tales for children, mythological stories, but I remember that I was really after true stories, not necessarily past stories. I could have read newspapers if my parents had given me newspapers. The important was to be aware of the truth that happened to human people across the world. I have never considered the past as a different country. I have always felt the past as alive. And so, for 40 years, I have been what Nietzsche calls a Don Juan of knowledge. And this means that my head is now really full of facts, of dates, of names. And from my student years, I have been haunted by this question: how can I, in a way, restitute this knowledge to the world? This has always tormented me, for I have never felt this accumulation as an end in itself. I thought that this knowledge had to be converted into an understanding, into an account of some sort. But for a very long time, I had not the slightest idea of what I would do therewith. And for a very long time, I have been convinced I would never write anything. So this is the first feature of my approach. And it is also a first tension. For as you know, philosophers are always quite hostile to erudition, to books. Just remember Deleuze in the Abécédaire, for example. And philosophers have a point, to think your mind has to be a little free. But on the other hand, the ignorance of many philosophers, I mean the way they ignore human historical, empirical realities, is very often abysmal. A second feature that appears in my childhood is a passion for freedom and social justice. It came, so it seems, as spontaneously as my passion for books. I was not raised in a left-wing family. It was a family with some liberal ideas, but quite conservative on social and economic issues. So here too, I remember that as a child, I would really feel shocked by the inequality of social conditions. And any injustice still shocks me today, to the point that I always, childishly, one could say, want to do something about it. I have never attained and always envied, in a way, the fatalistic wisdom of those who say, what can we do about it? Injustice is part of life. So this too has accompanied me until now with another haunting problem. How can I make a difference in the world with what I'm doing as an intellectual? For years, I have tried to make politics, but it never worked. I have never been an activist either. So there is a second feature and the second tension. You want to make a difference in the world with something that is not meant to. Knowledge can never be instrumentalized. It is an end, not a means. Otherwise, it becomes ideology. So while doing research, you must leave your convictions behind. And this is all the more difficult because knowledge is such a tyrannical lover. It demands all your time, all your energy. And recently, I came to the conclusion that I had to follow this path all the same, out of the conviction that in the end, it is directed toward freedom. A third and last feature has more to do with a peculiar style of philosophizing, more to do with this style than with the material of my philosophizing, that is the books, or its direction, that is freedom. And this style is war. Mind you, not violence, but war. That is an open conflict, an engagement, as we say in French, ruled by some laws, the laws of war. I realize it can sound strange, but it is true that until now, I have always conducted my intellectual activity more or less consciously as a military campaign. And this feature, too, appeared already in my childhood. I was fascinated by the great generals and war figures of French history. I grew up near the Invalides, which is a monument to French military glories. The whole neighborhood where I lived was filled with statues of generals. It was impossible not to come across them every single day. On the way to school, for example, there was the General Mangin, a World War I general. The pedestal read, Faire la guerre, c'est attaquer. To wage war is to attack. Later on, when I was a left-wing student, I disliked, of course, my childhood fascination for war. And I came to see this sentence as a ridiculous, coarse, primeval statement. Of course, waging war is attacking. Today, I know that it is not obvious at all. As we all know, the catastrophic 1940 defeat, the so-called debacle, came from a defensive strategy, a strategy defended in particular by Marshal Pétain. And I'm sure that this memory loomed in my unconscious, as in the historical unconscious of many French citizens. So this gave particular feature to my approach. Very often in books or in academical papers or in newspapers articles, I choose to target some strategical positions. Then I attack them openly. And this has many times been resented by my colleagues. I have been described as being too keen on polemics or as being a provocateur. And there is this sort of myth prevailing today that it's a sane intellectual society, as well as a sane democratic society, must be a place of consensus, of union. But the opposite is true. The democracy is nothing but the civilized managing of existing conflicts and divisions. Remember the potent words of John Lewis, good trouble. And the same is true for the intellectual world. I would like to quote in this regard a magnificent text by Pierre, the author of the extraordinary Dictionnaire critique on the Republic of Letters. He says, this Republic is an extremely free state. Only the empire of truth and reason is recognized, and under their auspices, war is waged innocently. War is waged innocently against anyone. Friends must be on guard against their friends, father against their children, fathers-in-law against their son-in-law. It is like an iron age. But again, war is not to be confused with violence. There are rules, and the rules of intellectual war are factual accuracy and the rules of dialectics. I stop here for time reasons, of course, but I wanted at least to indicate these three features: books, freedom, and a warlike style. I think one cannot stress enough the importance of these generally neglected sources of philosophical reflection. These are not so much childhood experiences as given features of the soul, given intuitions that make their appearance from childhood. And they have, as it were, guided my researches from the beginning until now. For I really feel that the four books you mentioned, my thesis on Roman philosophical practices, my book on Marcus Aurelius, the one on Lucretius, and the one I published 2 years ago on ancient philosophy in general, were parts of one single enterprise. And this enterprise is an emancipation project, an emancipation of ancient philosophy and more generally of ancient culture from modern projections, but also conversely, an emancipation of modern mind from all the scholastic mythography surrounding antiquity. there is always this back and forth movement. The more you dig into antiquity, the more you show its strangeness, its remoteness, and the more, paradoxically, you can harvest interesting keys, interesting clues, interesting tools that help you to question the world you live in. I always remind people of this very interesting dialectical motto of the socialist leader Jean Jaurès. A little internationalism keeps you away from your homeland. A lot of internationalism brings you back to it. So here, I would like to give 3 examples of teachings, so to say, I have dug out of antiquity. Teachings that is not dogmatic truth, but tools that one can use today. So in my book on Marcus Aurelius, my target was the spiritualist vision of ancient ethics, the one you find in Pierre or Michel Foucault. What I wanted to show was that ancient ethics defined itself as orthopraxy, that is the art of doing things right, without implying any interior or subjective life. On the contrary, I insisted on the physical, the social, and the aesthetical aspects of this ethics. The book on Lucretius, which will be published by Princeton University Press next year, started from Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve. Beyond his views on Lucretius and the Renaissance, what I wanted to criticize was this typical example of Whig historiography, where European culture is the theater of a radiant triumph of reason and modernity over religion and the Middle Ages. But I believe the most important teaching of that work I wrote on Lucretius is to have shown the autonomy, the sovereignty of poetry, and more generally of literature and art in antiquity. Both are forms of play in the noblest sense of the word. And here my book owes a lot to Donald Winnicott. My latest book, Ancient Philosophy, an essay in history, targeted the disastrous relation between many philosophers and history, beginning with their own history. I think the most important teaching of this book is the discovery of the fundamentally skeptical character of classical episteme. Skepticism, not dogmatism, was the main feature of ancient philosophy. And I think one can apply this to ancient historiography, ancient literary criticism, or ancient law. But as I said in the beginning, the most important is not so much the results as the method. So how would I describe my method? And first of all, what is the aim of this method? The aim is to understand what humans make, be it Vivaldi's Four Seasons, or Hegel's conception of the spirit, or Trump's coup attempt. What cannot, of course, apply the same techniques to every object. This is why method may be too rigid a word. I would prefer to talk of a particular take on the object. A philosophy can be summed up in a certain original intellectual take on the world. The singularity of my take is that, academically speaking, it belongs to no discipline in particular and draws on various sources. But I would like to highlight 4 of them. The first one is history. Although it is not fashionable to say so today, I must confess that I have very romantic idea of history. To me, like for Michelet, it is really about making past alive again. It is a sort of palingenesis. And here intuition plays a very important part. When I read ancient or modern historical testimonies, I have often the impression that the author is alive, that he comes at my desk and starts to tell me his story, his complaints, his views, etc. So beyond the analytical tools that are obvious to anyone, I believe history requires a certain intuitive faculty of empathy. The second one is philology. I understand the word in the broad sense it had in the 19th century. It is the science of, first of all, establishing the text. But this can be applied to facts, not only to texts. And then it's about trying to understand the meaning of it. Here, there is no room for romanticism. It is a wholly rational, analytical, classical science, a conjectural science, but a science nonetheless. And on that respect, it is a very important counterbalance to the romanticism of history. Thirdly, philosophy. I mean the philosophical tradition. Some philosophers have played a very important part in my reflection. Descartes and Nietzsche from the beginning. And more recently, Aristotle, because of his polymathic and dialectical approach to the empirical world. And surprisingly, Hegel, notably with his ambition of covering the whole range of human history and his focus on the problems of liberty. He inspires me very much too. And fourth and last, anthropology, that is the longing for a territory that is completely disconnected from your own, the study of which brings you a regard éloigné, a view from afar on your own world. So to sum up, you need an intuitive faculty of empathy, a philological rigor, a certain longing for exoticism, and a capacity for abstraction, for reasoning, for thinking upward. That is, you must, at the same time, be completely, as thoroughly as possible, grounded in the soil of facticity, of positivity, and at the same time, be able to think it over. Today, I have a feeling that my latest book closed a cycle dedicated to the study of ancient philosophy. What I'm studying right now is extremely heterogeneous. On the one hand, I continue to work on antiquity because there are always things that attract me there. So I continue to teach on it or to write on it. But recently, I have been contacted by Philosophy magazine because they wanted me to comment on the news. And I must say that it has been a turning point. I was already an obsessive reader of newspapers, but now for the first time, I had found a way to express myself in this field. So I have written a lot for them, for example, on the American elections or on the 1871 Commune de Paris. It takes me so much time, but that at the end, from time to time, I can see how the article could develop into a short book. So it can become overwhelming. Another part of my activities of today is translation. Translating some masterpieces of the past, like the Octavia attributed to Seneca, or the private life of the master race by Brecht, corresponds in a way to a sort of philosophical statement. Now I have just finished an annotated translation of Theocritus. And the fourth part of my activity is the direction of research. I must say that it's one of the things I love most. First of all, because it's always very comforting to see young people so passionate about culture. And then because thanks to them, I can explore some hypotheses I could not explore alone because they lead to academic domains that are not familiar to me, like music, religion, or literary criticism. So here I am today in the midst of this messy construction site, I have not tried to make it appear tidy, for it is not. The only certainty I have is that I want to understand what humans make, and through that knowledge, contribute to their emancipation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierre. So I have some question about your work, and coming back to what attracted you in ancient Greece. Well, of course, there are so many critics and thinkers who commented the Greek philosophy. Could you say what was your relationship with the thinkers who, if they are, who inspired you at the beginning of your research? How did you find your own way to read and reread ancient philosophy and philosopher? I have to say that, of course, well, I'm much older than you, but for me, that was an illuminating moment in the philosophy regarding the ancient Greece, and that was this glorious moment in the Greek studies in France at the end of the 20th century, with prestigious thinkers such as Jean-Pierre Vernant, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, Nicole Leroux, Marcel Détienne. And I have to say that by reading you, suddenly, you know, it is such a shock, because, and I thank you, because I had to reread also, and to have a distance regarding this fascination I had for these books about myth and well, myth et pensée, and especially because I was, you know, working on philosophy, and I had no, you know, I was not an historian, so I could believe anything. So but I would like you to say, well, because of course they attracted a big audience beyond the specialist of classics. And what do you think about their work, which refreshed the Greek studies? And could you say something about,
Yes.
well, about them, about this moment, about the école, this kind of school, you know, and more generally about the thinkers who inspired you and you know, make you interested in Greek philosophy?
Yeah. I think there are two questions in yours.
Sure.
The first one is how I came to study antiquity, and it's very interesting, because the honest answer is that it was the easiest way for me to study everything else. I mean, I had to choose an academic path, and since it was particularly easy for me to work on Greek and Latin texts, because I had this I don't know, this particular fluency, let's say, with these ancient languages. And of course, I was fascinated by this text, but I was fascinated by so many other things that I couldn't say there was a hierarchy, that I was more fascinated by Plato than by Shakespeare. So, but it was easier. It left me much more time to continue to read Hegel, for example. But if I had chosen the philosophy path, the traditional, it would have been much more difficult, because I was not, as you can imagine, already at that time, I was not at all a typical philosophy student. So it would have been much more difficult. And so this is the first answer. And then your question about the thinkers of on antiquity. I had to choose an advisor for my the beginning of my researches, and I immediately I was very much interested by Florence Dupont because and who, in a way, belongs to that school you were describing, that so-called École de Paris. But she was, I would say, a marginal figure. She was a little of an outsider inside that school. And I think because she was much more radical than they were. So she is someone that kept and keeps deconstructing antiquity, but without taking any, without respecting anything. She including herself. I mean, including what she had written. It's someone who always says that that book she wrote maybe 10 years ago is not good at all, etc. So at that time, of course, I read Vernon, I read Vidal-Naquet. I cannot say I was fascinated by them. I was impressed, of course, by their knowledge because I was a student. But I was not impressed by their, let's say, by their intellectual style. But someone really later really impressed me very much. And I think he was really the greatest of them all. And this is Marcel Detienne. I think he was a really potent thinker, much more powerful than Jean-Pierre Vernon or Pierre Vidal-Naquet. But there is an enormous there is an enormous lacuna in their researches. All these thinkers that practiced an anthropological approach to antiquity and that wanted to show us antiquity as the place of the otherness, they always respected philosophy. Philosophy had to be the birth of reason. Ancient philosophy had to remain the birth of reason. And I always quote a very strange and funny sentence by Marcel Detienne at the beginning of his book on Apollo. It's called Apollo, knife in hand, le couteau à la main. And he said, oh, reassure you, I want to reassure you, I won't touch the Apollo inspire of philosophers, the Apollo that used to talk to Socrates, etc. So why does he say so? It's always interesting to see that. So he will show the bloody aspects of rituals around Apollo, but he won't touch the philosophical institutions. And this is very interesting.
Yeah. Pierre, I think that you're perhaps a bit unfair with Vernon because he said that the birth of reason is not in philosophy, but in math and in economy. And but of course, yeah, you're right about the sacred philosophy that was constantly in their minds to shape the Greek civilization, of course. Just a naive question. Do you think that ancient Greece can teach us anything today? I remember, you remember that Nicole Leroux, against the reference from the Front National to selective Greek democracy that was also based on discrimination, could be a good reference for democracy today in Europe. And without the Lemetec. So, and Nicole Leroux, deconstructs this false genealogy between the ancient Greek democracy and the democracy of our present time. But, well, would you say that there are some lessons to take from antiquity, or not at all?
Yes, it's a very I would say it's a complex question, because there is the question of ancient democracy, and there is the question of ancient Greek culture in general.
Yeah.
So I would say, answering very quickly to this very broad question, that yes, of course, the study of Greek culture can give us many, as I said, many clues, many tools to live in a better world and to build a better world. I would like to mention three of them. First of all, their culture of dialectics, the fact that they are almost never dogmatic people. They are always putting things in discussion, and we as a culture, because of the Christianization of ancient culture, we have become a dogmatic and dogmatically and a morally dogmatic culture. And this is really, I would say, a poison. This is something that poisons the public debate. Second thing is the dignity of play. I have mentioned Donald Winnicott, but if there is a society where you can find how play was revered and not seen as today as something secondary or just fun, it's ancient Greek culture. And thirdly, polytheism, their religion. This is also the study of how it works is also an intellectual experience, a thought experiment that I think would be absolutely critical and should be mandatory to anyone. Now, the difficult question is the democracy, ancient democracy. I have read a very interesting essay by David Graeber on democracy. It's a short essay debunking the idea that we have anything to learn from ancient Athenian democracy. He says that today's democracy ultimately goes back to slave movements, women movement, workers movement of the 18th century, 18th, 19th century that have finally been adopted by the elites that had to take them. And I think he's very convincing, I must say. I must, of course, work on what he said, but I must confess that I think he may be quite right. That is, until the 19th century, no one ever had a positive, no one ever in the elites, in the classically educated elites, no one had a positive view of democracy. It really came out of these struggles, these social modern struggles that had nothing to do with antiquity. And then they, in a way, repackaged democracy, saying, oh, but you have these roots, these ancient roots, but democracy was almost, it was not a positive word in ancient culture. I don't
Oh,
hear
sorry,
you,
sorry,
François.
I was mute. There are several questions in the Q&A from Yanis Tsiligakis. I can't quote them all, but I will pick some of them. What philosophical attacks of you regret, what ones you are proud of, and what are your defeats, wins, and current battles? Yes, perhaps this first question.
It's I'm thinking. No, I don't think I regret any attack. But what can I say? Defeat. It's interesting. How can we determine if there is a victory of or a defeat? This is the difference with the real wars. I mean, it depends on the readers, of course. I have had real polemical struggles, but as I said, in France in particular, I think it's maybe different in the United States. But in France, in particular, it's very difficult to really fight on, and so when there was, for example, there was an article published by scientific journal, very important, the Revue des études grecques, by Ilsetraut Hadot, who is the widow of Pierre Hadot, and you know, she's a scholar, and so she was responding to my criticism of her husband, and unfortunately, I never was allowed to answer this. So I don't know. It's difficult to say if it is a defeat or. But anyway, I think it's what is certain is that it takes a lot of energy. It's not a metaphorical war.
Sure.
It's you really have to take risks, and this, of course, takes a lot of your energy.
Yeah, and your success is that for people like me, that we thanks to you, we completely rethink the ancient philosophy, and we reread the authors that we thought we knew very well, for example, Marc Aurèle, and especially also Lucretius. This is so convincing what you, and I of course, people like me, we have read so many comments on the De Natura Rerum, and yes, that's really illuminating, enlightening, the way you allowed us to understand the contradiction in the text, and that's so I have to say that, so well, we owe you a lot. And so another question from Yanis. Alfred Whitehead has famously said that, I quote, "All modern Western philosophy does not amount to much more than a footnote to Plato." Do you agree? Do you disagree with, and why?
Well, I think it is in a way it's true. I mean, it's true that philosophy as an academic discipline, as an academic discipline, ultimately goes back to Plato, but it does not mean that Plato invented it by himself. It means that the academical discipline that is called philosophy is based on a certain corpus of texts. And the texts that are the basis of this corpus are texts by Plato and Aristotle and their Neoplatonist commentators. You always have to keep in mind that I think we only you have to keep in mind that 95% of the ancient philosophical corpus, textual corpus, is or Platonical or Aristotelical or Neoplatonical. All the rest has been lost. So of course, but so of course, the philosophy as an academic discipline, being a commentary on this text, was bound to be a series of footnotes on Plato.
Pierre, now a very contemporary debate. Recently in the United States, some professors of classics claim that their discipline is marked by white supremacy, and that because classics emphasized only whiteness, and they even want, at least one professor in Princeton and another one, I think in Stanford, but they say that they want to cancel this discipline as such. What do you think of about it, about this very recent debate?
I think it's well. First of all, I think it's very interesting. I have followed these debates very closely.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I think it's understandable that in a culture where there is so much racism, it is understandable that you come to a point where radical positions, such as those you mentioned, come up. But of course, I don't think they're right. And I will tell you why. But I think you can understand it. I have studied in the United States for 1 year. I was linked to a classics department, and I was very a friend with a young Black student. And I remember very vividly that she told me of the racism she was exposed to in the classical field. I think that it shows that at least in some departments there were and there are some racist people that use the study of classics as they use it as a means to found their power, their white supremacy, if you will. Of course, this is not what classics is and what classics should be. So my whole work is, and the work of Florence Dupont, or the work of Jean-Pierre Vernant, and show it. It is an illegitimate, anachronistic, racist use of classics, but a bad use of a discipline does not condemn the discipline. So that is the first answer. Now, I would like to go a little deeper. I think that apart from this bad use of the classics, I think it is true. You can say it of the classics, but you can say it of every discipline, of anthropology. Some friend of mine from Cambridge told me of anthropological, a colleague, an anthropologist, who said, "Oh, poor you," because he's a classical professor in classics, and she said, "Oh no, the classics, they have to be cancelled. But we as an anthropologist, oh, we can stay because," and he said, "Are you kidding me?" I mean, look at how anthropology was linked and embedded in the colonial empire. So you can say that of every single academical discipline, they were all part of this imperial colonial system of domination. So this history has been made, is being made, and it has to be done over and over again. But the idea of canceling law departments, of medicine departments, we can go on and on, biology departments, because it, at a certain point of history, it served white power, is ludicrous. I don't hear you. I don't hear you.
You said that it's well typical of the what happens now in the American culture and in the United States and in Canada. But well, in France there are also some polemics. For example, there was this debate on a play at La Sorbonne with the question of the mask which were used, and also I remember Florence Dupont intervening in this debates and with a mixed opinion about. But what's your, and could you perhaps also say something and recall what happened and this
yes,
very
of course. I must confess, I have not followed this episode very closely, but let me remember. It was a show at the Sorbonne, a right. show of the Suppliant. How would you say this? It's a play by Aeschylus.
Yes.
And if I remember well, he, but I cannot say if it was true or not. But I remember that he was accused of putting the chorus members in black faces. Wasn't it that?
Not exactly. Well,
please explain.
It's not exactly black faces, but mask also was, which was referring to perhaps African references that was involved in this. Okay. In this play.
Okay, so you see, I don't remember very well the data, let's say, but I remember very well my impression at the time when I read the both positions, and I have had this impression very often while reading about this kind of conflicts. What really strikes me is really the impossibility to have a dialogue. Mm-hmm. On the one part, I feel that there is a kind of ignorance, a kind of a lack of culture, a lack of historical culture, a lack of conscience of how I mean, historical culture teaches you a certain amount of relativism. You are able to understand the other one's point of view. And so on the other part, what strikes me always is the arrogance, the complete lack of empathy, the complete lack of trying to understand how comes that some students come and shout. This colleague from Cambridge was at that show, and he tried to talk to the young people that were demonstrating, and he told me it was impossible. I tried to have a talk with them, and they just were shouting. It was a terrible suffering. This is very important. I mean, what all these stories, and I had the same impression with. There was also debate about André Chénier. I don't know if you remember. It's a little the same thing. He was André Chénier, the 18th century poet. He was at the, it was in the curriculum of the Agrégation de Lettres. And one of his poems tells of a rape. It tells of a rape. And some feminists said it was a scandal, that it had to be removed because it didn't approve of the rape. It just was describing. And again, I had this impression of on the one side, a terrible dogmatism and a complete lack of historical conscience. And on the other hand, on the part of the professors, the authors of the curriculum, a complete voluntary deafness. They were voluntarily deaf. They didn't want to hear anything about. Well, so I think no, we have to take into account the suffering. And we also have to take into account the history, the historical reality. For example, there was also this thing about the trigger warning, no? Or the
yes.
I remember that the first articles I read about it, but you know, I have you know, it was per chance, by pure chance, I have found again an email I wrote, but maybe 15 years ago. It was one of my first classes at the university. And at that time, there was absolutely no question of all these debates we have today. And I remember very, very well. So it was a class, I had to do a class on the rape of Lucretius. Yes, the rape of Lucretius. Of Lucretia, no? The rape of Lucrece.
Yes.
And the rape of Lucrece. And in this email, I was talking about that to a friend of mine. And I was telling her how difficult it is to teach about a rape. And you don't know if in the audience that there is not someone who has been victim of a rape. And so I said how it was, you have to be very delicate about how you present facts. So, I mean, it means that it is perfectly understandable that there is a point where you cannot teach about these things without taking into account a suffering that for many centuries went silent. You have all this suffering now that comes forth.
Okay, I totally agree with you, Pierre, and also about the problem of on one side, on the one hand, the dogmatism, and on the other hand, the arrogance. But at the end, you have to decide to console or not. And so, do you think that we should make a revision of the curriculum, or should we defend the you know the masterpiece? Because
No, of course, no. We must not cancel anything.
okay.
We must teach them because it's part of human nature.
Yeah,
It would be
and teach them through also the historical context to understand. And yes,
of course.
And your books help us to do that.
May I add something?
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
because it's really an issue that interests me very much. When you think of someone, because to understand what's going on, when you think of someone like George Steiner, who has been for many years, who was really considered really the Pope of Western culture, the embodiment of Western culture. Someone like that said, for example, that Malaysian music could not compare with Mozart. He said, yes, of course, we can imagine that someday there will be an African Proust, but do we seriously think that it could occur? I mean, that man could say that openly. It was completely racist and stupid, and he went on, and it was considered normal and wise. So I must say that although it's a very violent moment, I must say that I think it's good that such a moment has arisen. You know, I love this Our Time Is Now, you know, of Stacey Abrams. Her book is titled Our Time Is Now, and I think it very often. I think it's a very important moment.
Okay, Pierre, thank you so much for your talk, and hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you. Me too.
Process.
Me too. Bye bye.